Hello, everybody. I'd like to resume my teaching on Ezekiel 38. This will be part 6, and I want to call it Libya, Sudan, and Somalia will join the invasion. And the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshach and Tubal, and prophesy against him, and say, Thus saith the Lord God, Behold, I am against thee, O Gog, the chief prince of Meshach and Tubal, and I will turn thee back and put hooks into thy jaws, and I'll bring thee forth and all thine army, horses and horsemen, all of them clothed with all sorts of armor, even a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords, Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya with them, all of them with shield and helmet, Gomer and all his bands, the house of Togarmah of the north quarters, and all his bands, and many people with thee. Ezekiel 38, 1-6. The world's final conflict is heating up. Ezekiel saw it in the form of a huge coalition of Islamic nations joining forces to plunder and spoil the newly reborn nation of Israel. These nations have Islam in common. Islam insists that the last day cannot come until the Muslims rise up and slaughter the Jews. Wrap your mind around it, I kid you not. It is a tenet of the world's largest religion that the Muslims must annihilate the Jews before the end can come. Another thing these nations have in common is the rapid, horrifying transformation they have undergone in recent history, the last 40 years I speak of. We have shown how Turkey has morphed from a modern secular state back into the Islamic superstate that once menaced the world as recently as 100 years ago. For Iran, well, I had a friend in the late 1970s who was an Iranian student studying with my brother at Iowa State University. My mother knew no stranger, so she allowed him to come home and stay with us in the summer of 1978. He became like a brother to us. The Iran he came from was pro-Israel, pro-USA, and a very Western-friendly nation until President Jimmy Carter pulled the rug out from underneath the Shah of Iran, best friend the West had in the region. Since then, Iran has been transformed into the terror-exporting, Sharia-enforcing prison that she has now become. Ethiopia, which is called Cush in Hebrew, also will be in the invasion. Now, biblical Ethiopia consisted of all the lands south of the Nile in Egypt and would include what we know of as Sudan, Somalia, and parts of Abyssinia, which is what is modern Ethiopia. This region also is very heavily influenced by Islam. Sudan has suffered 3 debilitating civil wars in recent history between the Arab-dominated north and the tribal Christian south, and has been in a chronic state of insurgency. The first civil war occurred from 1955 to 1972. A second broke out in 1983 and lasted to the year 2003. And again in 2011, a civil war broke out, which lasts to this day. The state of constant warfare in Sudan has a very complex set of reasons, which include tribal reasons, religious reasons, and especially Islam and its ambitions to dominate the Christians and the animists in the south, economic reasons, cultural reasons for its primarily Arab up north and its black African tribesmen in the south. Now, more than 1 million people are said to have been killed in these wars, and the nation has fractured. Eventually, the nation of South Sudan was a breakaway nation formed in 2011, but it is in a state of continuous war to this very time from the north. Sudan is a place where you can buy slaves, black slaves, in markets. At one time, the price was $15 a piece. Now, Somalia also is a failed state, which hasn't had a truly functioning, consistent government in years. The nation has required constant intervention from Islamist takeover from the Ethiopian Army and the African Union and the United Nations. But most governmental systems there are so collapsed that the people have resorted to traditional methods of order, including a heavy emphasis on Sharia, civil and religious law, because Somalia is a devoutly Muslim nation. Now, Libya, like Turkey, was long considered to be a successful Muslim nation under the late Muammar Gaddafi. Love him or hate him, to his own people, he was fantastic. As a global research article reports from Professor Garakai Shengu, a scholar of Middle Eastern affairs at Harvard University, in 1967, when Colonel Gaddafi inherited one of the poorest nations in Africa. However, by the time he was assassinated, Gaddafi had turned Libya into Africa's wealthiest nation. Libya had the highest GDP per capita and life expectancy on the African continent. Less people live below the poverty line in Libya than in the Netherlands. And that's the end quote. Under Gaddafi's leadership, every Libyan citizen was entitled to a share of oil revenue, low-interest loans for houses, health care, grants for each child, education was free, women were given equal rights that would be unheard of in most Muslim nations. And that too, from the article again, I quote, "For over 40 years, Gaddafi promoted economic democracy and used the nationalized oil wealth to sustain progressive social welfare programs for all Libyans. Under Gaddafi's rule, Libyans enjoyed not only free healthcare and free education, but also free electricity and interest-free loans. Now, thanks to NATO's intervention, the healthcare sector is on the verge of collapse as thousands of Filipino health workers flee the country. Institutions of higher education across the east of the country are now shut down, and blackouts are now a common occurrence in once thriving and rich Tripoli. One group that has suffered immensely from NATO's bombing campaign is the nation's women. Unlike many other Arab nations, women in Gaddafi's Libya had the right to education, to hold jobs, to divorce, to hold property, and to have an income. The United Nations Human Rights Council praised Gaddafi for his promotion of women's rights," unquote. Now, thanks to NATO's bombing campaign against the reign of Gaddafi, now Libya is a corpse, a balkanized mess of competing savage militias, Islamic fiefdoms, a ruined economy, a fractured and spoiled healthcare system. It's a nightmare for women due to various strains of Islamist attempts at Sharia. I quote from the article again. "The fall of Gaddafi's administration has created all of the country's worst-case scenarios. Western embassies have all left. The south of the country has become a haven for terrorists, and the northern coast a center of migrant trafficking. Egypt, Algeria, and Tunisia have all closed their borders with Libya. This all occurs amidst a backdrop of widespread rape, assassinations, and torture that complete the picture of a state that has failed to the bone," unquote. It's apocalyptic. This is our Western intervention. Since it, Libya is in a continuous state of civil war, and it has three major foreign armies within it vying for power over the wrecked nation. It's also a place of proxy war as Turkey and Egypt pour money and mercenaries into the dying corpse of the nation in order to establish their own upper hand in the region. This is the sad transformation of what was once one of the most benevolent nations to its own citizens and guests in the whole Muslim world. How many can remember Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's famous boasting, a perversion of Caesar's quote? She said, "We came, we saw, we killed him," and she broke out in a cackle. She's speaking of the assassination of Muammar Gaddafi. Now, Gaddafi gave the West an ominous warning as he pled for his life on national TV. This was censored in the West, by the way, to the effect that if NATO killed him, Libya would collapse and the last barrier to the tsunami wave of desperate African immigration would flow into Europe and destroy it. And I quote Gaddafi himself, "Now listen, you people of NATO, you're bombing a wall which stood in the way of African migration to Europe and in the way of al-Qaeda terrorists. This wall was Libya. You're breaking it. You're idiots, and you will burn in hell for thousands of migrants from Africa and for supporting al-Qaeda. It will be so. I never lie," he said. "I do not lie now," said Gaddafi in an open letter obtained by the Russian daily Zavtra and published in May 2011, several months before the Libyan leader was killed. Unquote. Western-backed mercenaries from Somalia, Chad, and Sudan tortured and murdered Gaddafi in the streets of Libya, and the chaos which has followed opens Libya up to its own participation in the last great invasion as Turkey, Iran, Russia, and other entities train thousands of Libyans in the only work presently available as a military mercenary. And I quote the article again. 3 years ago, NATO declared that the mission in Libya had been one of the most successful in NATO history. Well, the truth is, Western interventions have produced nothing but colossal failures in Libya, Iraq, and Syria. Lest we forget, prior to Western military involvement in these three nations, they were the most modern and secular states in the Middle East and North Africa, with the highest regional women's rights and standards of living. Now, God's purpose in prophecy, my friends, that's unquote. God's purpose in prophecy will be worked out, but the West, including the United States, is guilty of great and profound atrocity. May God have mercy on us all.